Welcome to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the First World War. I'm Dan Hill, a military historian and battlefield guide specialising in the history of the war on the Western Front.
And I'm Dr. Spencer Jones, author and senior lecturer in war studies at the University of Wolverhampton. In this episode, we'll explore the use of poison gas on the Western Front during the First World War, looking at how it came about, how it developed throughout the war, and the devastating effects it had on the man on the battlefield. Hello, Dan. Always a pleasure to be joining you on the podcast. And today we're going to be talking about one of those subjects which I think is just completely synonymous with the First World War, gas warfare or chemical warfare, if you prefer. And when I think of the First World War, I think one of the most enduring images I have in my own mind is the image of a soldier wearing one of those comparatively crude gas masks. And I think perhaps if we took this image to anybody out in the public, they'd probably recognize it as being synonymous with the First World War. And I have to say, even as we're about to prepare for this episode, the image of gas warfare, I think, is still a very haunting one.
Yeah, hi Spence. Of course, gas warfare, as you say, totally synonymous with the First World War. And I wonder, as we go through and kind of unpick this story, I wonder if it's got almost an over-representative connection with the First World War, which sounds maybe a little flippant to say. But in terms of the position it holds in our memory compared to the actual impact it has on the battlefield, whilst enormous, is maybe in some cases a little bit misunderstood. And that's why I'm really looking forward to covering this today, because when we unpick the story of gas warfare and, of course, its famous evolution throughout the war, there are some really significant moments, some of which we stick in our mind for very important reasons, other ones almost completely overlooked. And, that's the fascination with the whole story of the war on the Western Front, as far as I'm concerned. But of course, we've got to start somewhere. And, we need to start with understanding why gas was used on the Western Front in the First World War.
That's the fundamental question. And it all goes back to what we've discussed repeatedly throughout this series. And that's this imbalance between the attacker and the defender. The defenders are in trenches. They're screened by barbed wire. They have machine guns supporting them. They have artillery supporting them. And for the attacker to breach these positions is extremely difficult. It's extremely bloody. It's essentially impossible in 1915, certainly. And with this deadlock setting in and with the war becoming static, armies on both sides begin to think, well, how do we actually breach these positions? Most armies don't have enough artillery. They don't have weight of shell. They don't have quality of shell, as we've discussed in the artillery episode. So what other methods can be used? And an idea that is lurking around even before trench warfare begins in the combatant armies is, what if we use some form of gas? What if we use some sort of chemical agent that is going to knock out the enemy soldiers and allow us to get into their position? And there had been some use of, we wouldn't necessarily call it poison gas, but we would call it gas in 1914. The Germans and the French had both used types of tear gas in an attempt to try and inhibit the movement of enemy troops. In fact, the amount of tear gas used in all cases in 1914 was so low that it basically went unnoticed. These were essentially tear gas rounds that might be used by police to break up strikers or protesters in pre-war societies. No use on the battlefield, just couldn't produce enough. But by 1915, the Germans are leading the way on coming up with ways to use their very powerful chemical industry. Germany has the most advanced chemical industry in Europe in the era of the First World War. How do you use this to produce some sort of chemical agent which can overcome these trenches? If you can't destroy the trenches with your artillery, the men inside them are really beyond your reach because you don't have enough shells. What if you had a chemical weapon that could enter the trenches and could kill or incapacitate the defenders? Well, if that's the case, then your troops could simply storm over into those trenches and find all the defenders are knocked out or have been killed or maybe have run away. And it's that desire to find a way to breach the trenches, to knock out the defenders, that really inspires this. And the Germans lead the way with this development.
Yeah, they do. And it's worth pointing out, if we go back in time, of course, the idea of using chemical warfare in inverted commas is not new to the battlefield. In various different ways, chemical warfare has been used. We're talking about during sieges, people flinging corpses of animals across into the enemy encampment to try and cause illness, and other ways of incapacitating. Famously, at the Battle of Crécy, supposedly with archers dipping the tip of an arrow into into some excrement and then firing it at the enemy. You know, the idea of using these kind of unconventional methods of warfare is not brand new, but using it, I think, on an industrial scale, which is the point you just made there, Spencer, I think is new. And to the levels that we're going to see it when it's first used on the 22nd of April 1915, just outside Ypres, all of a sudden things change. And they change in a particularly brutal and ghastly way for the men on the ground. So I'm totally in agreement. You know, chemical warfare is, I mean, it's, let's be honest, it's utterly horrific. And it really raises the stakes in an already horrific environment. And for those guys that are going to first experience it, of course, one of the worst things to think about is, of course, there's going to be no defense. And this is something that we're going to see. And unfortunately, French Algerian troops are going to experience in April 1915 on the Western Front. And we should point out here the very first weapon that's going to be used in this context and on this scale is going to be chlorine gas. This has been weaponized by perhaps one of the most complex and fascinating characters of the entire First World War. Even though he never visits the front line, he doesn't spend time on the front, but his name is synonymous not only with chemical warfare and weaponizing chemical warfare, but also in terms of probably, and this is a stat I heard a little while back, probably the last few billion people on the planet can thank this particular man for it. And that's because the guy we're talking about is a chap called Fritz Haber. He's a famous German chemist, German Jewish chemist before the First World War, and he is responsible, in effect, for weaponizing chlorine. Now, I think we'll come back to the ins and outs of that in a moment, but he also later on creates something called the Haber process, which is a way of synthesizing ammonia for use in agricultural fertilizer. That literally revolutionizes agriculture around the world, and being able to get that amount of foodstuffs has been said to have accounted for the last couple of billion people on the planet today. He also wins the Nobel Prize in 1918. I mean, there's quite a few controversies about this chap. We'll come back to him in a moment, but he is responsible, in effect, for creating chlorine gas. As we said, he's a pre-war eminent chemist in Germany. His wife is a chemist PhD. And to give you a little flavour of just how complex his character is, not only is Haber, of course, a patriotic nationalist German, he's also German Jewish. His team, not him directly, but his team are going to be responsible for the production of Zyklon B in the interwar years, which is a louse killer, in effect, a decontaminant. And that, of course, is going to be turned on German Jews during the Second World War. Very complex character. His wife, believe it or not, Spence, commits suicide in May 1915, very likely as a result of Haber being part of this team that actually releases chlorine for the first time on the battlefield. Very, very complex. We could go on about Fritz Haber for hours and hours. But I think most important is to find out actually what the effects are of chlorine and just how deadly they are when they first appear on the battlefield in April 1915.
And this is a very interesting point. There's a few points to emphasize a little here as well. One of the first I'd like to really emphasize is who is being exposed to this attack. Because this is 22nd of April 1915. It's on the Ypres front. There are some French colonial troops in the line. Now, these are French colonial troops primarily drawn from Algeria. They're a mixture of white French from Algeria and also natives from Algeria. There's also some French colonial troops who've come all the way from Martinique. Again, they're actually white soldiers rather than black soldiers. But they're in position there. Bear in mind that where they are from effectively the French Empire, they're from the colonies, they're from relatively unindustrialized parts of this empire. And there's something quite deep, darkly ironic, perhaps, that these soldiers who have come in some cases from the wilder areas of Algeria are about to be exposed to the full force of modern industrial chemical warfare as they face the first major gas attack in the First World War. And that, I think, contributes to what happens to them because they have never experienced anything like this before. In fact, nobody has. This is the first major chemical weapons attack in human history. And the chlorine gas release that the Germans are about to make is actually, it's relatively crude. There's no shell that can deliver it. There's no mortar system that can deliver it. It's literally cylinders, big gas cylinders that are moved into the front line. secretly under cover of darkness, and then at a designated time, it's around about 5:30 in the evening, actually, or the late afternoon, the chlorine gets siphoned from the tanks and it produces this gas, which is very distinctive in appearance. It's this sort of gray-green cloud. It looks very unhealthy. It gets compared to an infected wound or an infected boil. And it's obviously very alien. And you see this huge cloud drifting towards you as a soldier. You know that this is not normal. This is abnormal. There's something very wrong with this. And bear in mind, listeners, that if perhaps we were to see that type of cloud drifting around, we would be surprised. If there was a chemical spill in your neighborhood or a leak and you saw it, you'd think that looks really bad. I'm going to get out of the way. Well, of course, for the French colonial soldiers, they can't get out the way. They are occupying the trenches. And this great gray-green cloud, this puss-looking cloud, floats over their position. And even before it actually descends on their position, soldiers can smell in the air this very distinctive tang of chlorine. And of course, anybody who's been to a swimming pool or swimming baths, you'll have experienced that smell yourself. But now it's going to be on a much, much greater concentration. And if you've ever spent too long in a swimming baths, you probably know your eyes might water, your eyes might sting. Well, imagine that effect thousands and thousands of times over. And not only is there therefore the visual of this cloud coming towards you, you also as a soldier are very aware it's something wrong. It's making your eyes water. It's making the back of your nose burn. You've no idea what it is. Your medical officers don't really know what it is either. And it rolls over to you. It's propelled by the wind. The wind is blowing favorably for the Germans and it rolls into the French position. And of course, once it's on top of you, as you breathe it in, you're going to start to choke. You're going to start to cough. You're going to start to panic, struggle for breath. Natural reaction, you want to get out of that as fast as possible. And you're going to try and run away. You're going to try and retreat. Although the soldiers at the time don't know this, that's one of the worst things you can do under a chlorine gas attack, because by running away or moving very quickly, you actually start to breathe more. Your heart pumps faster, you take bigger and bigger gulps of air, which gasses you even more. And chlorine's effect on you once you inhale it is actually pretty appalling. It reacts with the water in your lungs, it produces acid, and in sufficient doses, it will quite literally it'll melt your lungs, which is an agonizing and a slow death. So it is an appalling weapon. And I don't think it's any surprise that the French colonial troops panic and effectively flee, abandoning their equipment and retreat from it, because I'm not sure any troops in the world would have stood their ground.
Yeah, the effects of chlorine just utterly horrific for those guys who've got, of course, got no defense against it. It's famously been called drowning on dry land before, which is quite simply an allusion to the idea that you ineffective you are internally drowning as your lungs fill with fluid, causes edema, and what a horrific thing to experience. And another thing to point out here as well is that chlorine gas is heavier than air, and so what you tend to find is that these waves of chlorine that are going to get released in these early attacks, they're going to end up dropping into the very place that these men are occupying. So there's no cover to be found in a trench, because chlorine is going to quite literally lap over the trench and then fill in your trench. So being above ground is a safer position than being within a trench, or certainly within a dugout. This is going to become a big problem later in the war. And as you say, Spence, running back or trying to run back, get back as quickly as you can. For those that are going at the right speed, say you're traveling at an average of 5 miles an hour, if that chlorine gas cloud is going at 5 miles an hour, you might well find that you're not actually escaping it, but rather staying within that. And, as you say, you start breathing more heavily, start panicking, of course. You've got animals dying around you. It's utterly horrific. In fact, it's so effective in that first attack, which happens in the northern part of the Ypres salient, around the little villages of Saint-Julien and Langemarck. It's so effective that the Germans are surprised and don't really capitalize on the opportunity they've got, because that opening salvo of the Second Battle of Ypres, Spence, apart from perhaps the Battle of Gellivelt in 1914, is about as close as the Germans get to actually breaking through, isn't it?
It really is. This is, in fact, it could be said to be one of the greatest missed opportunities of the First World War. And just to emphasize a little bit about this, I'm sure we'll do Second Ypres as a battle in a future episode, but the Germans aren't really planning much for this attack. They want to actually use this attack as a distraction measure. They want to keep the British and the French occupied, so that the Germans can transfer troops for the ongoing invasion of Russia, because Germany and Austria-Hungary are invading Russia in the spring and summer of 1915. So it's really a diversionary attack to cover a troop transfer. And the Germans are using chlorine here mainly as an experiment to see, well, does it work? Can we get something from it? And it is incredibly effective. It just blows a hole into the Allied line, absolutely leaves a gap. It's about 7 kilometers across, about 8,000 yards across, as the French colonials melt away. And you can't blame them in this situation. But the Germans aren't really in a position to exploit this advance. They're completely surprised by how effective it is. And it also should be added that their own soldiers haven't really been briefed on chlorine gas or how to interact with it. And German soldiers are a bit reluctant to follow this gas cloud. They can smell it. It's making their eyes water. It's making their back of their throats close and burn. They're a bit cautious. Well, we don't want to advance into that huge gas cloud. And so the follow-up attack is actually relatively small. And although there'll be future gas attacks at Second Deep, never again will the Germans get quite an opportunity like this. And one of the great what-ifs, if they'd been positioned and ready to follow up with a couple of good divisions, they might finally have captured Ypres, which, of course, remains in Allied hands for the entire war. So it's a great what-if. And listeners, I suppose the next natural question is, okay, so the first gas attack is incredibly effective. Why there are subsequent gas attacks at this Second Battle of Ypres, but they're not quite as effective as that first one on the 22nd. And I'm thinking specifically about there's a gas attack 2 days later on the 24th of April against 1st Canadian Division, Dan.
There is, and the Canadians actually, and this is around St. Julian, a place known as Vancouver Corner, which is only really on the southern part of where this initial gas attack goes in. And the Canadians are famously put forward for holding the line against this gas attack. What we need to remember here as well is in these very early attacks, there are already differences that need to be considered. Things like wind direction, wind speed, concentration of gas, all of these kind of things. And whether you're getting a full dose of gas with no protection whatsoever, or whether really pretty much straight away people are identifying what it is. And this, I think, is part of the story of the Great War, because we cannot underestimate just how big the shockwave is that goes through the ranks of the British Expeditionary Force and, of course, the French army when gas is first used. It is immediately realised this is a war changer. May not be a war winner. In fact, I'd argue it isn't a war winner, but it is certainly a war changer. Because all of a sudden, you've got millions of men on the Western Front facing a weapon that they have got no protection whatsoever against. The very day after gas is first used, it's actually identified very quickly, I believe, by a Canadian chemist who figures out exactly what has been used. Immediately, the wheels are set in motion for having any kind of protection whatsoever against gas. And it's remarkable just how quickly that comes in. Even as quickly as those early attacks, a few days later, there were already word going around saying, look, we haven't got anything specific against this, but we can give you some suggestions as to what might nullify the effects of gas. We can talk about the Royal Army Medical College at Millbank back in the UK, who are actually going to do the first real heavy lifting in terms of trying to get some anti-gas measures in place to those men out on the Western Front. But there are some really ad hoc ones as well, Spence, things that are just chucked in. Do this, hopefully you'll be alive, and at least you'll be around to fire your weapon and repel any follow-up advances.
This is where your regimental medical staff come in, because 2 days after that initial gas attack on the French colonials, there's a second gas release, 24th of April, on a very, very shaky British and French position that's primarily held by the 1st Canadian Division in their first major battle of the First World War. And the Germans hope to repeat the trick. They hope to do exactly the same as they'd done to the French colonials, release a big gas cloud onto the Canadians, make them rout. But very quickly, the Canadians, and bear in mind, this is just 48 hours after the initial attack, the Canadians have worked out and have circulated the information that a simple, albeit not completely reliable counter is just to get some sort of cloth, a handkerchief, a bandage, piece of uniform, anything, tied around your mouth, an ad hoc face mask, and make it wet. Water will do the trick, although on the 24th of April, the general belief is it's better to urinate on it. And this is actually an example of science, because if chlorine interacts with urea, which is present in urine, it forms basically a harmless, mildly acidic chemical. And so the soldiers are told very quickly, urinate on your handkerchiefs, your bandages, just wrap them around your mouth. Not very pleasant, I'm absolutely certain, but it will actually save your life. But one thing that strikes me about this is imagine the mental strain. You're a Canadian soldier, this huge gas cloud's coming at you, and it's coming at you, you can see it. You can see it, you can smell it, and you're trusting to a handkerchief soaked in urine wrapped around your mouth. You must have needed nerves of steel to stay in that position. And of course, gas is so poorly understood by the common soldier at this stage. It's one thing to have your regimental first aid officer say, yes, this will save you, this will work. And you can see he's got it on. But my gosh, Dan, I'm not sure I'd have had the nerve in 1915 to just stand there and trust to such a crude method. And yet it actually works. It's not perfect by any means. If it falls off, if your mask falls off or it's not quite right, you're going to get gassed. It's still going to affect your eyes. You're going to have very, very running eyes, but it's enough to save your life. And these improvised methods produce this huge reaction in both Britain and France. In Paris, the ladies of Paris are mobilized to effectively produce all kinds of mouth coverings that will protect French and indeed British troops. In Britain, the popular Daily Mail, the most biggest selling newspaper in the First World War, actually encourages the ladies of Britain to start manufacturing pads that can be wrapped around the face of soldiers. And they don't look dissimilar to those disposable masks that we all had to wear during COVID. And they're being produced in their tens of thousands extremely quickly as an improvised solution to chlorine gas. And German chlorine gas release at Second Deep, they make other chlorine gas attacks. They're never as effective again as they were on the French colonials, who of course had no protection. And I think this actually sets a pattern on the First World War. And that's that there's a sort of arms race to do with poison gas, whereby one side will introduce a new type of poison gas, which is very significant and briefly gives the attacker an advantage. But then the defender will introduce a new form of treatment or a new form of protection. And it's this sort of, you've used the phrase in previous episodes, Dan, a tit for tat relationship. Who can get the edge? And in this one, I think this is a fascinating battle between trying to find a type of gas that can penetrate defenses, whilst at the same time trying to find methods that can protect you from increasingly sophisticated chemical weapons.
Yeah, that's true. And just in terms of that scaling, I think it's something that's really important to work out here. Just how much panic is found within the ranks of the BEF alone. There are 2 million cotton pads created in just 1 month. So from the very first day that gas is released, a month later, there are 2 million cotton pads that have been distributed around to the BEF. Such is the fear and concern that gas causes. Now, of course, these, as you said, Spence, they're not particularly effective, particularly against the eyes. And we'll come back to, I'm sure, the real, if you like, the real objective of gas in the Great War. But what we need to remember is that there does need to be some defense and some formalized defense, something far more effective that's going to allow you to keep fighting, that needs to find its way out onto the battlefield very quickly. The first of those is going to be something called the P helmet, which is, in effect, a cotton bag that you put over your head with a little bit of a strip of kind of early plastic, I think it's formica, that goes over the eyes to allow you to see. This has been soaked in, I think it's phenohexamine. It's a solution which has got properties that are going to allow gas particles to stick to the outside of the bag that are not going to mean that you're not breathing it in. Now, these do saturate. They only last about 15, 20 minutes. They'll saturate in a gas attack, but they're better than nothing. One of the problems that we find with them, though, and this is maybe comes to the bigger picture of what gas is about in the First World War, is that those bags steam up very quickly. They're very hot, they're uncomfortable to wear, they're difficult to fight in. And this, to my mind at least, Spence, is the crux of gas warfare. It doesn't necessarily kill a lot of people, but it makes doing everything a hell of a lot harder. Makes you a less efficient soldier. To my mind, that is the story of gas in the Great War.
You're absolutely right, Dan, because wearing a gas mask, a gas helmet, or a gas hood is incredibly wearing on the user. It's wearing really for two reasons. On one hand, it's hot. It's going to steam up in there. The vision pieces that you have are going to get steamed. You're going to have difficulty seeing out of them. They're going to get scratched. They're going to be reduce your vision. So it's difficult to see out. It's hot. You're going to be sweating in there. The air that you're breathing is going to be recycled. And of course, we've all lived through the COVID pandemic. You might remember if you had to wear your mask for a long time, especially in the early part of the COVID pandemic when we were relying on relatively crude masks. You'd start to smell your own breath. It would start to get hot and uncomfortable. It wasn't very pleasant. And we were not fighting a war wearing them. Imagine wearing a full scale hood and having that, this stifling air inside, difficult to see out. And because the air's basically stale inside, it's going to be slowly reduce your performance because you're sweating, you're not quite getting the right amount of oxygen, you're going to get really tired. And if you're fighting and manning machinery, operating a machine gun or an artillery piece, you're going to get exhausted so much faster. So there's the physical aspect and there's the psychological aspect because you're trusting your life to this item that you're wearing on your head. If there is a tear in this gas mask, if you haven't quite put it on properly, if something breaks or is damaged, the gas is going to get in there and you're going to be gassed. And that's a really wearing psychological effect for any soldier because, of course, it can happen at any moment. You may be wearing your gas mask, perhaps you've worn it for 10 minutes, an artillery shell bursts distantly from you, and a single piece of shrapnel happens to just take part of your gas mask off with it. Well, suddenly you're going to be exposed to a gas cloud that you might be fighting in. And so there's this real psychological wearing pressure. And it's strange because in the grand scheme of the First World War, you are by far more likely to be killed by artillery shells or enemy bullets. I think First World War casualties actually killed by gas amount to about 1% of all the fatalities. So your chance of being killed by gas are actually really low. You're much more likely to be killed by artillery or bullets. But the nature of how gas kills, the pressure on soldiers, the fear of gas is absolutely huge. And you can understand why. Nobody wants to be gassed. It's a particularly unpleasant death, not least because if you're given a high exposure to gas, we already mentioned chlorine or later forms of gas, often your death won't be instant. It's actually going to take a long time and it's going to be very painful and it's going to be very prolonged. So it's a terrifying weapon. So this combination of you're physically exhausted wearing the gas mask, especially if you've got to run. I've mentioned operating machinery, but imagine if you're attacking, moving through a gas cloud, you've got to run or move, dive to the ground, fire. You've got a huge gas mask on your head. You're going to be exhausted very quickly. And it's psychologically terrifying because if there's a slight flaw in this, if it's not quite right, then you've got a serious problem. You're going to be gassed. So in that sense, as a psychological and a wearing weapon and a suppressing weapon, it's really, really powerful.
Yeah, just I mean, I don't think we can really overestimate or overstate just how important this is. If you think about just the practicality of it on the battlefield, you can't drink, you can't eat, you can't do any of those kind of normal functions. You also can't communicate very well. And you imagine a noisy battlefield trying to speak to somebody else, and all you can see is somebody else wearing a bag on their head through your steamed up bag on your head. All of a sudden the efficiency of soldiers becomes super low. Now, if you add into the mix German attacks coming up following that, men with bayonets with fully functioning gas masks attacking directly after that, it's just such a difficult environment to be in. And that fear, I think, holds a much greater place in the story of the Great War, and particularly the memories of the men who fight there, than actually the performance it ultimately has on the battlefield. That being said, there are some very, very deadly gases brought out. In fact, the one that follows chlorine is, I think, pound for pound, the most deadly gas of the entire Great War. It's not particularly sophisticated. Much more sophisticated gases will come in 1917. But phosgene, that's first used in December 1915, it's actually used at that time around Vieier, which is also in the Ypres salient. It's used as a chlorine phosgene mix, is a brand new gas that's going to come in. And it's by far the biggest killer as far as gas goes in the Great War. It's about 6 to 10 times more toxic than chlorine. So very, very dangerous. Also, something that's particularly concerning about this is it's got a pretty benign smell and it's also colorless. This adds a whole new element of terror to the battlefield. In fact, a number of men, many smokers, of course, out on the Western Front at that time, some men notice and mention that the only really reason they can discern that there's something different going on is that the flavor of their tobacco changes. There's a slightly different taste to the tobacco as they smoke. The other concern with phosgene is it's got a bit of a delayed reaction, Spence. It's going to take effect 24, 48 hours later. So this has got almost a blind terror to it because you're actually not aware of just how deadly this stuff is, and sometimes not even aware that a gas attack has been made until all of a sudden you start feeling hellishly sick.
Mm. It's a really horrible form of chemical warfare, and it's a step above chlorine gas. Chlorine gas, incidentally, will continue to be used in various forms throughout the First World War, and delivery systems get better. Obviously, in early 15, you open a cylinder and hope it blows across. If you've listened to the Battle of Loos episode, you'll recall that the British had mixed fortunes with their use of chlorine gas. But phosgene, as well as being, you can release it from a cylinder, but mainly it gets fired through shells. And this adds to what you've been saying, Dan, because you've got a bombardment going on, shells are exploding around you. And mixed in with that bombardment, as well as high explosive and shrapnel, there's phosgene shells. Now, to a soldier's eye, when a phosgene shell explodes, it just looks like a high explosive shell going off, perhaps with a smaller charge. And because phosgene doesn't have a color, as you say, you don't actually know you're being deluged with phosgene until it's too late. And comment about tobacco, I've read a number of times that soldiers who are smoking pipes or smoking cigarettes, or in some cases even chewing tobacco, say it starts to taste a little bit different. It starts to taste like hay. I've never eaten hay myself, but apparently the soldiers were aware of what hay tasted like. The smell as well, very, very faintly, it's been compared to moldy crops or moldy hay, but it's very faint. And bear in mind, the battlefield is a bad smelling place with all the mud, the destruction, the smell of the smoke, and so forth. Very, very, very difficult to pick up. And of course, that psychological pressure that you might be under a gas bombardment and not even know it's happening properly is really, it just adds to the terror and adds to the fear that these weapons are actually able to inflict. And as you say, Dan, it's not a gas. Chlorine will knock you out or kill you very quickly, certainly knock you to the ground. Phosgene won't necessarily do that. It tends to actually kill people a little later, 24 to 48 hours. And it's by far the deadliest of the chemical weapons used. And I don't have the exact statistics to hand, but from memory, it's something like 85% of all gas warfare related deaths are caused by phosgene. Because by the time you realize you've been poisoned by phosgene, it's basically too late to be effectively treated. So it's very, very dangerous and absolutely despised, I have to say, by the soldiers who come under fire from it.
Yeah, and continuing that tit for tat idea, all of a sudden the P helmet, which is just about good enough to look after kind of mild doses and maybe defend against mild doses of phosgene. Bear in mind, these bombardments, and the Germans have figured out by now that gas masks are going to get saturated. In fact, the British realised this, and in September 1915, when they first used chlorine gas at the Battle of Loos, what they're going to do, and we see this quite a lot, is they're going to actually mix chlorine with smoke. So you might see a kind of a cloud traveling across no man's land. Well, the Brits, when they first use it, they don't have more than about 20 minutes worth of chlorine. But what they can do is do 5 minutes of chlorine, 5 minutes of smoke, 5 minutes of chlorine, 5 minutes of smoke. And it takes a very brave man to take their gas hood off and figure out which bit is chlorine and which bit is smoke. So you can imagine it allows these troops to do things like saturate the gas masks. And put yourself in the situation, listeners. You're 18 minutes into a gas bombardment. You know your gas mask is getting saturated. All of a sudden, you just see this continual cloud of gas. What are your options? I mean, do you leave your trench? Do you get out of that heavier than air environment? Can't really do that. Can you take your gas mask off, perhaps replace it with a second one? All of a sudden the options are very, very limited. And so what the Brits will do eventually, and in fact very quickly, is to start improving the quality of gas masks. And they're going to bring in various new types. The pH hood is going to be slightly more effective. The material is about twice as thick and it's in two layers, which means that you've got a longer gas protection. So this is going to come in really as early as October 1915. It's also importantly got a one-way valve on it. So rather than breathe directly through the material, which is hard to do, it gets you hot and tired, you actually clamp a one-way valve with a closing rubber seal on the end. And as you breathe out, it expels your hot air. But when you breathe in, it's not going to then drag the air from outside in. It's also got glass eyepieces They're much less susceptible to steaming up. So we do see, even in small senses, these, if you like, these evolutions. But phosgene is going to change all of that because it's so deadly. There's already work behind the lines, actually back in the UK, Spence, going on about a new type of defense, which ultimately is going to spell an end to cloud gas attacks, at least on the Western Front. And that's going to be the small box respirator.
This is the definitive anti-gas piece of equipment. The small box respirator gets introduced in variety of things that are pushing it forward. But above all else, it's the experience that the British have fighting on the Somme, where there is, of course, as well as enormous bombardments with conventional munitions, there's also a lot of gas released on the Somme. We tend to forget that the Somme there's so much gas used, both chlorine and phosgene. And one of the problems actually the British have had is using gas, particularly phosgene gas, on German positions, and then advancing into them is a problem. There's a risk you're going to gas your own troops in doing this. And there's constant call, really since mid 1915, to improve the helmet system. You've mentioned the P helmet and so forth, to produce a genuine respirator, a multi-part respirator. And listeners, if you've ever seen a photo of soldiers, particularly Allied soldiers in the First World War, in their gas masks, they've got the gas mask, they've got the tube that goes down to the box. That's the box respirator, or the small box respirator, that's usually fitted on their chest. That's what we're talking about now. And in its original form, it was effective, but it was enormous. You actually had to wear the box part on your back. But by September 16, you've got the small box respirator, and it is a fantastic piece of equipment because it's relatively light, it's very robust and durable. It's much more robust than the original hoods, which got a risk of being damaged or torn. It's effectively, it gives you immunity, provided you can get it on and provided that it's not breached at any time. It makes you immune to both chlorine and phosgene. It doesn't, it has to be said, make it any easier to fight in. You're still running around, you're still sweating in there, your lenses are misting up. There's all those kind of problems. But what it does do is it drastically reduces the potential lethality of asphyxiant gas. And that's not only obviously valuable to the soldiers in that they're not being gassed and poisoned and killed, but it's also very psychologically powerful because the soldiers gradually, and soldiers are naturally cautious of new equipment that comes in that's promising to do all kinds of things. But it's found with the SBR, the small box respirator, it genuinely does work. And provided you can get it on in time and wear it during a gas attack, you're going to be safe. And so it increases the confidence of soldiers. And although it's still uncomfortable, by the standards of the First World War, it's a lot more comfortable than the gas hoods. And it becomes iconic and emblematic. And if there's one thing I think of, as well as just the classic sort of battlefield images of soldiers with respirators, it's photos taken behind the lines or sometimes even after the war. Because if there's one thing that British soldiers in particular like doing after the war and behind the lines, it's wearing box respirators in inappropriate places. There's definitely, it amuses the soldier of the First World War to wear these. But in actual fact, as a piece of equipment, they are extremely effective. And the downside in some respects is the effectiveness of the small box respirator means that the Germans, looking for a new edge in chemical warfare, they stop using cloud gas attacks because the box respirator basically stops this. The Germans then start looking for a new weapon that can penetrate the box respirator.
They do, and something you just mentioned there, I think is worth dwelling on for a moment, Spencer, because to my mind, one of the major weapons that gas, or yeah, one of the major weapons that gas does provide in the Great War is fear, and it's instilling fear into the enemy. And as you rightly say, small box respirator provides confidence eventually to British troops. That in turn dissipates the fear, which means that you are going to need new weapons to come about, and we'll come on to perhaps the most famous one in a moment. Just to say a final word about the SBR, though, the small box respirator. These are so effective and they're produced in such big numbers. Famously, White Hart Lane, Tottenham Hotspur's football ground, is basically turned into an SBR factory, and some 16 million SBRs are produced there during the war. Most certainly the most impressive thing that's ever happened at that particular football ground. But it's one of those things that we need to, we need to really acknowledge. The scale and speed of production of anything gas related in the Great War is really it's incredible. It goes to show just what the fear is like. But then when you get something that really works, like the SBR, all of a sudden that can change things. Now, going back to the famous and inevitable tit for tat method, we need to think about new style of weapons. And the Germans are well aware that the SBR is very effective. So what they're going to start employing now is a new weapon, which is going to be synonymous really with gas in the Great War from 1917 onwards, known to the Germans at the time as Ypres, better known to the British and the Allies as mustard gas, which, Spence, is actually a little bit of a misnomer because to call mustard gas a gas is maybe a bit of a stretch.
That's absolutely true because, in actual fact, it's released in form of a liquid. It's more of an oily liquid than it is a gas, and it's delivered through shells. You can't actually release it through cylinders because it won't float. So it bursts, it plummets to the ground, and this is where it becomes super deadly because it doesn't just land on the ground, although it creates puddles. It can create puddles. It sinks into the soil, but it doesn't go too deep. And that means that when you're fighting in areas that have been deluged with mustard gas, if you dive to the ground, if you go prone and you put your hand on that ground, you're going to burn your hand because the effect of mustard gas, and this is, of course, one of the reasons it picks up this name, is it is a blistering agent. It's going to burn you, and it's going to burn you horrifically. Its effects are agonizing by all accounts. And you only need a relatively small skin exposure to actually be injured by this. And it has all kinds of appalling knock-on effects because once it's on you, it's actually quite difficult to get off. It's got that oily effect. So if you try and brush it off with your other hand, you'll just blister yourself. Its ability to penetrate uniform is depends on how the level of exposure, but any kind of exposed skin is going to be very, very vulnerable to this. And if you're in an area that is being deluged with mustard gas, it's particularly effective against your eyes. If you happen to have your eyes exposed in any way, shape, or form, it can blind you very, very quickly. And I'm sure many listeners will be familiar with the very famous and vast painting by John Singer Sargent, famous artist of the First World War, that's called Gassed. And it's showing a group of British soldiers. They've all been blinded by a mustard gas attack, and they're being led through a devastated battlefield. It's a very powerful painting, very powerful image. And mustard gas is perhaps the most hated form of gas, even more so than phosgene. Because although your gas mask, your small box respirator, will at least protect your face and your eyes from mustard gas, the fact that if your body is in any way exposed to the ground, mustard gas is deluged, it's going to get burned and blistered, is appalling. And mustard gas as well can actually remain active in an area for days, weeks, perhaps even months if the weather conditions are favorable. You read appalling accounts, particularly from Passchendaele, about soldiers going past shell holes that are now filled with water, and they've got this awful sort of yellowy green surface. And that's because the mustard gas has got in them and has effectively created an acidic bath. And the effects of mustard gas on the human body really can't be overstated. That it inflicts horrific and agonizing burns and wounds. And a quote that I'm always reminded of with this is from Vera Brittain, of course, famous British novelist and author. She was serving as a nurse in the First World War, and she wrote about the effects of mustard gas privately. And she wrote, "I wish those people who talk about going on with this war, whatever it costs, could see the soldiers suffering from mustard gas poisoning. Great mustard-colored blisters, blind eyes, all sticky and stuck together, always fighting for breath, with voices a mere whisper, saying that their throats are closing and they know they will choke." And that's the reality of being, I'll use the phrase gassed, or at least exposed to a mustard gas attack. And the effects, if a unit is caught in a mustard gas attack, can be really devastating, Dan.
Yeah, there's one particular incident actually that sticks in my mind, and it takes place on the 11th of May 1918 around a little village called Vieier, which, of course, in standard British Tommy parlance of the day is renamed Funky Villas. And it's the good old 1st Battalion Hertfordshire Regiment who are marching through, just moving up to take over a section of the front line on the 11th of May. They've got a battalion of 513 men, so 513 officers and men, and they get absolutely saturated in a mustard gas attack, just as they're fairly nonchalantly marching behind, well behind the lines, I should say, moving up to take up positions. And in that one attack, of the 513 men in the battalion, by the end of the day, 511 are in hospital. Doesn't kill a lot of people, perhaps kills 20, 30, maybe a few weeks or months later, but it totally destroys that battalion. An entire battalion is taken out of the British order of battle. It is utterly devastating. And the thing about mustard gas, amongst others, is you don't actually need to see those shells explode. And as you said, Spence, you just think quickly about a group of people walking along the road, and all of a sudden you get a shell that bursts above you, and it rains down like an aerosol or a mist all over the surfaces of your clothing, the ground around you, and it's just going to sit there. There is absolutely nothing you can do about that. And if you're under the very first one, two, or three shells, if you can't get your gas mask on quick enough, you're in major trouble. And we have to bear in mind as well, shells, gas attacks aren't necessarily used in isolation. You don't only get chlorine or only get phosgene or only get mustard. Quite often you'll get a mixture of two or three, or even add in other agents which are going to confuse and complicate the situation. So it's really important. In fact, that's why the British Army, as soon as the small box respirator comes along, is going to place incredible effort, particularly in training behind the lines, to make sure men can get on their respirators as quickly as possible. It's always the last item of kit that you wear. So it's always the first one that you can get access to. And men are drilled and trained regularly on how to react to gas attacks. But as the Hertfordshire's proved, sometimes you just can't get away from it. Some well-placed shells that just deluge an area are going to cause incredible casualties. And I think, Spence, one of the really important things to understand, particularly when it comes to the long-lasting effects of mustard gas, given the properties and the nature of it, is that it doesn't even only affect the men who are actually gassed themselves. Because when you start putting gassed men into the casualty evacuation chain, it brings a whole set of risks for those that are actually treating those people.
It does, and this is the absolute horror of mustard gas because it is viscous, it's sticky, it's oily, and you only need a few droplets to burn you. It really is that potent and powerful. And there's problems as men enter the casualty clearing chain. They've been mustard gassed, and one of the first things you're going to do is you're going to try and clear that mustard gas off their skin, which apparently is agonizing because you're putting disinfectant onto this burned skin. You're trying to clean it. For the soldiers who are affected, it's absolute agony when that happens. But mustard gas, because it's this viscous, difficult to clean liquid that lasts for days or weeks, you as a medic can be gassed in turn, just be in close proximity to a mustard gas victim as you're trying to clean their wounds. You can get it on you and you're burned. It's also a problem with uniforms because wounded men will be, of course, have their uniforms taken off, especially if they've been infected. It's got mustard gas on it. And as you're actually undressing them, you get burned by the mustard gas too. And for the soldier who's been mustard gassed, he's in agony. And if there's one thing that really strikes me about the effects of mustard gas, it's that reading about treatment of these soldiers or even men who were mustard gassed and survived, all of them talk about the pain. Now, the First World War is filled with things that will cause you pain and injury. It's not unusual to have this type of thing. Sad as it sounds, there is a high risk of physical injury here. But the medical staff and the soldiers of the war all comment that mustard gas produces a special form of agony. You're being slowly burned alive, and to be treated when you've got a mustard gas burn is agonizing as well. Your entire body is on fire. I'm reminded of a quote from a British nurse about this that's quoting Tim Cook's very, very good book, No Place to Run, The Canadian Corps and Gas Warfare in the First World War. Highly recommended if you're interested in the Canadians and their experience of gas. And a British nurse remembered about a mustard gas casualties. She remembered they cannot be bandaged or touched. We cover them with a tent of propped up sheets. Gas burns must be agonizing because usually the other cases do not complain, even with the worst wounds. But gas cases are invariably beyond endurance and they cannot help crying out. And these are hard men. These are tough soldiers and they're in so much pain. Even they're calling out all the time. And mustard gas is the most common cause of gas injury for British soldiers by a considerable quantity because the small box respirator is greatly reduce the lethality of chlorine and phosgene. Mustard gas itself will kill. If you're exposed to enough, you'll die of your injuries. It's estimated it kills somewhere in the region of about 4,000 British soldiers. But spare a thought for all those men who are injured by mustard gas, because this will give you burns and scars and serious injuries that are going to be with you for the rest of your life. And so, although we said at the start of this episode that only about 1% of fatalities on the Western Front are due to gas, think of the injuries that particularly mustard gas causes, and it gives a new understanding for why the Allies hated mustard gas so much.
Yeah, I think sticking with the idea of the medical side of things, at least, and if you like, going back to the idea of why gas is so effective, and we are, of course, lumping mustard gas in with other gases here, but it just comes back to this idea of really, it's not necessarily an aim to kill in the First World War. It's an aim to incapacitate. And there are a couple of things that I think we can bring out here, particularly with relation to mustard gas, because as far as the big picture of the war of attrition on the Western Front, the aim of the enemy is to try and wear down your troops, remove big numbers of troops from the order of battle. So when the time to come over the top and attack and win the war happens, you've got an easier job of doing it. I think this is something we've fairly well established over the previous episodes. Now, by killing a man, as sad as it sounds, that's one man who can no longer fight. That's one man out of the order of battle. But by wounding a man, particularly something like blinding somebody with chemical warfare, all of a sudden the burden isn't just on that one man. It cascades down the chain because you have to now evacuate that wounded soldier. And if you've got a blinded soldier in the front line, in, of course, agony, how are you going to get them back? They can't find their own way back. Somebody has got to take them. Maybe two people have got to take them. So if you've got a company of 200 men, you get 30 of them killed, you've got 170 left. If you've got a company of 200 men, you get 30 of them gassed, you've maybe got 120 or 130 left. This all of a sudden adds big pressure on those troops in the front line, and it starts to create the conditions for where victories can be achieved. But at the same time, going back to this tit for tat idea, and John Singer Sargent's famous image is a perfect example of that. It's how the British Army is going to adapt. So instead of now taking two men to move one man out of the line, what can happen with 10, 15 guys who have been blinded is a fairly simple but effective method. And that's quite simply to get those guys to put their hands, almost like a human train to a certain extent, put the hand on the shoulder of the man in front, and then you can use one good set of eyes at the very front of that to replace the eyes of those guys that can't see, and literally walk people out in a giant, rather tragic conga back towards medical aid. So there are ways that the British Army can overcome and overadapt. But I think one of the key things, Spence, that we shouldn't overlook here is not necessarily that killing troops is the intention with gas warfare. It's reducing the enemy's efficiency.
Mm. And this is something that is really the essence of chemical warfare in the First World War. We've rightly, I think, dwelt on the horror of gas warfare and the horrific injuries it inflicts. But even those injuries, even the horrors of mustard gas poisoning, and you certainly wouldn't want that to befall you or your friends, your chances of actually receiving mustard gas poisoning, being wounded by it, are far lower than your chance of being killed by artillery or bullets. You're much more likely to be killed or wounded by those. And this raises the question about, well, why do the armies use chemical warfare so much and so consistently through the First World War once it's clear it's not killing or wounding that many troops? Yes, it kills and wounds, but compared to high explosives and shrapnel, its effects are much, much lower. And you've hit on it. You've given the answer to it, Dan, because it's about suppression and it's about making life difficult for the enemy soldiers. Because in this grueling industrial battle, even the slightest advantage you can get as the Allies or indeed the Germans is worth taking. And if you can force the enemy to wear gas masks for a long time, if you can force the enemy to circumnavigate certain parts of the battlefield because they've been drenched in mustard gas, then you are at an advantage. And I think another thing we tend to forget is how long you have to wear these gas masks for. You might be wearing these gas masks for 12 to 24 hours without taking them off during intense fighting. And of course, once phosgene's around, it's so risky if you're in an active battle area not to wear these gas masks. That you wear them as part of the course, and it is wearing, it is tiring, it is grueling, it is unpleasant. It's got this psychological effect too, because you can't talk properly to your friends, you can't see their faces. It impersonalizes the battlefield around you. It greatly reduces your field of vision, so that's frightening too. The experience is disturbing and frightening and grueling, and actually doing something very physical, like manning an artillery piece where you've got to load and fire, or crossing a battlefront, particularly if you're carrying heavy equipment. If you're a light machine gunner and you're lugging the machine gun on your back and you're wearing your respirator and you're crossing broken ground, that's incredibly exhausting. And soldiers report that it creates this feeling of nausea. They get lightheaded, they feel unwell, they get a overwhelming sense of claustrophobia. Wearing a gas mask is in battle is pretty deeply unpleasant. And so both sides continue to use gas because it just diminishes the effectiveness of the enemy. They're worn out, they can't see, they're tired. If you can keep them wearing their gas masks, that's going to have an effect on them. And both armies take advantage of this with things like night gas bombardments, not to support an offensive or anything like that, but just to disrupt the enemy. You'll suddenly deluge a trench area with gas to force everybody who would normally be asleep to sleep in a gas mask. Apparently, that's not very pleasant. I can't imagine it myself, but sleeping in a gas mask he's wearing, it disrupts your sleep. Things like this are used all the time. And the Allies in 1918 started to get a real advantage in terms of production, especially with the arrival of the United States, which goes very big on chemical warfare itself. The Allies don't initially actually have a mustard gas shell. They don't really get one of those until the 100 Days. They occasionally use German stocks of captured German stocks of mustard gas shells, but the Allies don't really have them until the 100 Days. But what they do have is just enormous quantities of phosgene, which they can dump onto German positions and force the Germans to fight wearing their gas masks. And that greatly reduces the fighting capacity of anybody in the front line. On that, and just as a tit for tat element, we mentioned this in the 1918 Spring Offensive episode, but in early 1918, the Germans actually come up with a new twist on phosgene gas attacks. And the British come to know this as double cross. And this is a combination gas attack that the Germans use where they fire a shell which has actually got a vomiting agent in it, which can penetrate small box respirators. So you can actually, if it deluges a position, Allied soldiers breathe it in and it induces nausea and vomiting to the point they'll actually be sick in their gas mask. That's going to make you want to tear your gas mask off, just get some fresh air, clean your gas mask. But if you do that, you'll be exposed to the phosgene cloud. And the British refer to this as double cross. And it has some effect, certainly in the Spring Offensive. Some soldiers just cannot bear this experience of vomiting in the gas masks and pull it off, get gassed, get given a lethal dose of gas. Others, they keep the gas mask on, but imagine, listeners, everything we've just been saying. It's hot in that gas mask, can't really see, stuffy, and then you've got a face full of your own vomit as well. I mean, this is just ghastly stuff, Dan.
Yeah, that kind of very brutal evolution gives you just an idea of how horrific this experience really is. I know many of us have got family stories of relatives who were out and experienced gas on the Western Front, whether it was a huge deluge that put them in hospital or just a whiff of it that caused injuries and discomfort for periods of time. You can imagine, when you get these things like double cross, it's such a bitter, it feels extremely callous a way to do this, to induce a vomiting agent, which is going to force you to take your gas mask off. A sneezing agent is employed as well in a similar kind of capacity. You just don't know what's arriving. And this is one of the real fear elements, I think, that's included. Nobody knows what's in that shell that's just exploded above their head. You might just be looking at the high explosive shell, which is just split into pieces. It might be a shrapnel shell. It might be phosgene. It might be diphosgene. It might be chlorine. It might be mustard. Nobody really knows. And that kind of continual fear must be incredibly wearing on the guys. And bear in mind, when we're delivering by artillery, it's no longer only the guys in the front line that have to worry about this. It's guys at rest, 3, 4, 5, 6 miles behind the lines, who could be hit by this at any point. And, if you combine that with the effects of, I'm thinking of places like Vieier in 1918, when the Australians, basically the town of Vieier is just drenched by multiple different types of gas for days on end. Days. You can't eat, you can't sleep, you can't drink. You're wearing a steamed up mask. I think the feeling of isolation in wearing a gas mask, anyone's ever put a gas mask on or anything of that kind of caliber, all of a sudden this battlefield with all of this peripheral stuff around you just shrinks down to a few centimeters around your face. That must be terrifying in itself. And now add in enemy attacks on top of this, people charging at you with bayonets and you being forced to fight. The horror, it's just must have been beyond belief. And I think, Spence, whilst the story of gas, I think, really should be one of fear, of course, we do need to cover the idea of casualties, the amount of casualties sustained by gas. Now, there's a huge caveat to this as well, because the numbers that we've got, one, they certainly can't be accurate. And secondly, the bigger, and I think by far more important number, is one that we'll never know. And that's people who suffer from those effects after the war.
Mm. And this is something that the science of studying this it's really in its infancy. But there's a lot of anecdotal information to suggest that soldiers who are gassed, or and whether that's chlorine gas, phosgene gas, or mustard gas, have serious subsequent effects. And the long-term health effects of being gassed are grueling. You can't really recover from them. If you've had lung damage from chlorine or phosgene, or if you had serious burns from mustard gas, you're not going to get over these. There's some suggestion that exposure to mustard gas leads to a much higher instance of skin cancer and also leukemia, which of course is untreatable in the 1920s. Exposure to chlorine gas and phosgene gas makes you much more likely to contract tuberculosis for reasons that aren't fully understood, perhaps the damage to the lungs, and suffer other lung infections. And so even if you survive, even if you've been given a good gassing, you've taken a heavy dose of gas, there is a chance that your life after the war is subsequently going to be cut short. It's going to be curtailed. You're going to die basically as a result of those wounds. We don't have the full statistics for these, but it's noted in Britain, France, and Germany in the 1920s and 30s that gassed veterans seem to be dying much younger than other veterans of other arms. Now, it's not universal, though. I'm thinking in particular of Basil Liddell Hart, who's a famous British author, military historian, theorist in the 1920s and 30s. He's extremely badly gassed in 1916. But the damage he suffers, though he lives for a very long time, lives well into after the Second World War, the damage he suffers is psychological. He goes to war in 1916 as a courageous, determined, perhaps slightly naive young officer. He gets terribly gassed on the Somme, and he's psychologically scarred by it for the rest of the war. And I imagine soldiers who survived a gas attack and perhaps did not have serious injuries from it and did not have their lives curtailed as a result. Imagine the psychological weight of having lived through that. And imagine that the effects, they must have haunted them in dreams or in just their quiet moments for years afterwards. And spare a thought too, listeners, for the fact that lots and lots of civilians get gassed as well, especially during the Spring Offensive and the 100 Days, because both armies are moving. They're often operating in and around areas where there's still substantial numbers of civilians. And if a village is being defended, for example, although best efforts, certainly by the British and the French, are made to evacuate the civilians, in some cases the civilians can't move if they're elderly or if they're infirm. They just have to shelter in their basements and things like this. And there's a substantial number of French civilians and Belgian civilians, for that matter, who get inadvertently gassed in this as well. They're actually treated by army medical staff if they're available, but that's a frightening thing as well, and is an aspect of chemical warfare I think we're apt to forget, that it's such an indiscriminate weapon that it goes everywhere and it affects everything. And just to add emphasis to this, disposing of gas shells, which are still uncovered to this day, is a really tricky job. This gas is still dangerous, especially mustard gas. Mustard gas will still burn you if a shell breaks or cracks or detonates a century after it's been used. And it sort of captures something about the cruelty, the indiscriminate nature of chemical warfare. And perhaps that explains one of the reasons why we don't see chemical warfare on the same scale in Europe again.
Yeah, and in terms of scale, I think it's worth just clarifying here. We're talking about 2 million British alone, British battle casualties on the Western Front during the Great War. And in terms of actual numbers, officially at least gassed, we're talking a little under 10% of that. About 186,000 men are officially put down as being wounded by gas in the Great War. The number of those killed is much, much smaller. We're talking certainly less than 10,000, perhaps less than 5,000 as well. So in terms of the at least during the war or official casualties, the number is very low. I just want to make a slight point here, Spence, as well, whilst we're talking on in terms of the post-war care for gas, because there really, as you say, there really is very little written information. But I can give you a little bit of anecdotal information from my own great grandfather who was wounded by gas on the latter part of the Battle of the Somme in 1916. He suffered from terrible lung complaints in the years after the war. He'd been a footballer pre-war, and he was told on going to the doctors that the best advice, was for him to go to the local park, lie down with his face to the grass, and breathe through there. That was the height of the medical knowledge and the medical advice that he had at the time in the post-war years. It's we'll never know exactly what the casualty numbers are from gas. In a way, I don't think it's hugely important to understand those numbers, but it is important to understand the context of what these men went through, and just how horrific that experience was on the Western Front.
I think this is one of the reasons why, especially for British Empire and American forces, that after the war in the 1920s and 1930s, when people reflect on the horrors of the First World War, one of the things that crops up so much in the English speaking world is mustard gas. Just the memory, the cultural memory of mustard gas. Because even if you haven't been gassed by it yourself, you might have seen somebody being gassed by it. You've certainly will have heard all about it as well. And it's this sort of haunting psychological damage, really, from the idea of gas and everything that it stands for. And in the 20s and 30s, as gradually the world settles down from the intensity of the First World War, people reflect on the use of gas. There's a revulsion really to its use. And that's not to say that chemical weapons aren't used. There's still use of chemical weapons in conflicts around the British and French Empire at times. It's used in the Russian Civil War. The Italians use it during their invasion of Abyssinia. But the mood towards chemical weapons changes as a result of the First World War. And it's reflected on even in the 20s and 30s that for all the horror this weapon inflicts, for all the misery it causes, in terms of changing the battlefield or allowing a victory to be won, it's not really that effective. What wins the war, as we've said many times, is combined arms, artillery, infantry, tanks, and aircraft. And so there's a sort of move against chemical warfare, which seems to inflict untold misery and absorb an enormous amount of production resources, but perhaps isn't all that militarily effective. And I think perhaps that's one of the reasons why we don't see large scale use of chemical warfare in the Second World War, for example.
Yeah, and it's one of those big questions, and it comes up a lot actually when we talk, particularly when we're out visiting the battlefields and talking about gas. Why wasn't it used? I think there's a couple of things. One, as you've just said, it takes up a lot of resources. The second thing to bear in mind, though, is gas warfare and chemical warfare production has increased and improved and continued in the post-war years. In fact, at the end of the First World War, there's a new type of gas that's making its way to the Western Front. It's actually literally on ships on its way to the Western Front that would have probably again revolutionized the use of warfare in of course, a horrific way if the war had gone on to 1919. Thankfully, it was never used. But in the Second World War, there were certainly more deadly, more potent gases available. My own gut feeling, just don't think anybody wanted to go there. Nothing good was going to come out of using gas for anybody involved on the Western, on any of the fronts in the Second World War. And I, for one, am incredibly glad that it didn't happen.
I think you're absolutely right. By the Second World War, you've got nerve agents, which are much more deadly than the old gases of the First World War. And it's interesting that at the end of the war, in the Second World War in Europe, the Allies have got quite substantial chemical weapons stocks on hand, just in case. Germans, the Nazis, also have chemical weapons stocks. Neither side has used their chemical weapons, even though all sides are equipped with gas masks. And I think it's a memory of not just the horrors of chemical warfare in the First World War, but also a knowledge that once somebody pulls the trigger, it's going to lead to this tit for tat response. You're going to use your chemical weapons, the enemy will use their chemical weapons, and there'll be this constant escalation. And it's not entirely dissimilar to the concept of mutually assured destruction, the idea that no one will ever fire a nuclear weapon because the response back to it will be utterly annihilating. And so you can't win. If you fire a nuclear weapon, you'll be annihilated in turn. And perhaps there's something like that with chemical warfare in the Second World War, this knowledge that once you start it, it's going to escalate and it's going to go out of control. And you can't guarantee that you're going to be the dominant chemical weapons power at the end. And I agree with you, Dan. I think given all the horrors, of course, of the Second World War, the fact that at least the soldiers are spared chemical weapon attacks is, I suppose, a very small mercy in a vast war.
It is, and the First World War, of course, is as we said at the very outset of this podcast, synonymous with the use of gas warfare. It's as we've learned, a huge part of the cultural memory and people's experience on the Western Front. Is it a war winner? The simple answer, I think, has got to be no. But it's certainly a war changer, and it's certainly a life changer, both during and for many years after the First World War.
We'd like to thank everybody who's left a review for this podcast already, or perhaps posted a question or a comment. We do read all the reviews, we read all the comments, we read all the questions, and we're very grateful if you've taken the time to do so. If you haven't, please do leave a review for this podcast on your podcast platform of choice. Every review we have helps to grow the podcast and will allow us to record more episodes just like this one.
Yeah, and a special final thank you to our friends and supporters over at Patreon, whose support in allowing us to create content just like this is absolutely essential. So if you haven't already, or you do find it of interest, why not head over to Patreon and check out some extra perks that we've got available for the Not So Quiet on the Western Front podcast. You've been listening to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, a Battle Guide production. If you've enjoyed this podcast, why not check out the Battle Guide YouTube channel, where we regularly release documentaries exploring some of the most famous and extraordinary episodes from throughout military history. If you'd like to support the Battle Guide team to create more content just like this, why not head over to our Patreon, where for the cost of just a cup of coffee, you can get access to full-length virtual battlefield tours, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, decide which subjects we cover in future podcasts and videos, and join a fantastic community of like-minded people. That's all this time. See you again soon.
Is that a delivery?
Yeah.
This is proof we record live. Dan's been interrupted by a delivery.
I don't know what it is. It looks like it's bubble wrap, I think. Weird.
Weird. We should have got him on the podcast to do a special guest spot.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Sorry about that. All right.
No problem.
Where were we?